too personal, and you're almost conflicted by just human nature to be able to give really competent, solid feedback on compensation. So the reality is, most of the surveys I've done after a few false starts in that area, I don't really delve a lot into compensation because I'm not sure you get quality feedback. Having said that, um, I sit on, as Dan mentioned, 5 corporate boards now, and I won't call out which one, but they recently did an employee pulse survey towards the end of the whole COVID experience. And interestingly enough, the feedback they got from their employees, that 86% of the employees prefer to have the option to work at home post-pandemic. And frankly, to a large degree, when I saw that statistic as a result of that pulse survey, I thought back to my experience when you ask people about their compensation. The reality is, it's probably part of the American dream to be able to wake up every day and decide whether you want to go to work that day or whether you want to stay at home and potentially work at home. It's not about the work, it's more a function of having that optionality of deciding if and when you come into the office for work. And I must say that when I looked at this statistic, I said, that's really interesting, but I'm not sure it's the right answer. And let me speak to that a little bit. But before I do, there's a couple things I want to make really clear as I delve into this topic of when and how we go back to work. Clearly, until the risks of the pandemic are behind us, the first and most important thing we need to do is follow the law. We've entered a period of time here somewhat unprecedented, where in many respects our work rules are being dictated by our government officials, whether it be at the state level, federal level, state level, in many cases the local level. Ordinances and decrees are being passed which really govern us as it relates to what our work rules are, when and if and how we come back to work. And job number one is to make sure we follow those rules. Nothing that I say or believe should supersede that as a priority. The next thing I would highly recommend to all of you is that you, in the aftermath of any legal direction, you definitely follow your boss. Because again, there are a lot of opinions, a lot of folks out there in terms of how does this really work and how should it work? And I'm sure there are a lot of leaders out there with varying opinions. And I highly recommend you listen and follow the direction of your boss, regardless of whether I agree with it or not. My return to work discussion today assumes that it's safe to do so. So to be clear, until all of the stars are aligned and we've got the vaccination statistics, the herd immunity statistics, the law, your boss, when all of that's lined up and we're really in a position to safely return to work, then I think it's time to really talk about some of the issues that I'd like to discuss with you today. So I'll start with my premise. I believe that this let's all work at home concept that some organizations are kind of promoting, I think those organizations over time are going to struggle. I would put a stake in the ground and say that those organizations that believe you can use Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatever your favorite connecting device is that's going to be the tether between the employee and the employer. And that's going to be the string that ties that individual to the culture of that organization. I believe over time, they're going to struggle and perhaps that string is going to break. And these are some of the things that I really believe we've lost over the last year to year and a half. And we have a tendency sometimes to have the pendulum move too far, too abruptly. In the case of COVID, we had to go from a situation where our economy was booming, our job statistics were terrific. There were so many good things happening in our economy. So many companies were achieving great success by just about every measurement. And it's not like anything was broken. It's not like we woke up one day and said, oh, we really need to radically change the way we work. The reality was we were hit by a force, an external force completely unplanned, unpredicted, and in most cases, never even considered, which caused us to dramatically change the way that we work and how we tried to work through a historical pandemic. And the things that we've lost are things that we have to focus on and think about before we just throw them all out, because we've somewhat adapted to a new way of working. And one of those things, in my view, is this notion of connection. I think we've lost a tremendous amount of the connection that we had, connection with our employer, connection with our supervisors, our managers, our leaders, connection with our coworkers, in many cases, connection with our customers and our vendors and other relationships that are really important. We've lost a lot of that, and we've done our best to utilize these streaming services to try to hang on to as much of it as possible. But my belief is we've lost that connection and we need to get it back. In many instances, we've lost what I refer to as the power of positive energy. You know, when you come to work and you work as a team and you're in an environment that's collaborative, where there's sharing, where there's relationships being built, where there's trust, and the organization is moving forward in a successful way, it creates this thing called positive energy. And if any of you have been in an organization where it exists, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you know how powerful it can be. You probably, in many instances, have been part of organizations where, in fact, that positive energy is not there or it's been lost. And you also know how detrimental that can be. I think it's extremely hard to create that energy over the internet. Looking at, basically stamp-sized photos of people and communicating in this kind of one-way communication device that we've all become so accustomed to over the past year and a half. And that positive energy is something that we've lost, and in my view, we need to get it back. We're losing social interaction. I hope many of you have found, as I have, that as much as it's been nice to not be schlepping through airports as much as we once did and spend time in traffic commuting and all those things that were the negatives, the reality is we have a lot of friends and associates that we work with that are important to us. And that social interaction, not just the working relationship, but the friendship and the opportunity that we have to learn from and interact with and be a part of the lives of the people around us is super important. And if you're like me, you've missed it tremendously over the last year and a half, and we need to get it back. And it's very difficult for me to believe that we can get it back via Zoom. It's an opportunity that only exists when we can come together fairly regularly and build those kind of relationships and have those kind of experiences. Now, there are positives of this work at home concept, and I don't want to walk away from them. There are probably more than I'm going to list here, but as you could see from the Pulse survey I shared with you earlier, in many instances, this has made a lot of employees happy to be able to have the flexibility to work at home, spend more time with family. A lot of people enjoy the fact they don't have to commute, get up in the morning. Maybe you shave, maybe you don't shave, maybe you put on work clothes, and maybe you put on sweats. It doesn't require you to have the discipline and the rigidness that a lifestyle requires when you're going to work every day, going to an office every day. There are a lot of aspects of that I think people found somewhat liberating and made them happy, and that's great. I can tell you from a leadership perspective, the whole work at home concept has really addicted leaders to the notion that you can really save a lot of costs when your employees don't come to work. People are already looking at how can we reduce our office and rent expense. Budgets for travel and entertainment have been slashed like crazy. They've been kind of taken out of the cost basis of the company. Sometimes it's hard to put back things that have been taken out. And there's no question about the fact that in many instances, companies have become leaner in the way they operate as a result of a lot of their employees, or in some cases, all of their employees, working at home for a period of time. Clearly, this reduces traffic at commute times. And in many instances, for people that had fairly long commutes, they found out, geez, it's extended my day to not be spending whatever it might be at both ends of the day commuting back and forth to an office. And that's certainly an advantage. It's an interesting question because I've talked to a lot of people, and I try to really get below the surface of this issue of how productive are you working at home? And some people will argue vociferously that, boy, I'm more productive because I don't have that commute time. I'm really in a situation where I can clearly maximize my hours of the day. I've set up an office at home, everything. I'm really more productive. I'm getting more work done. The reality is, I speak to a lot of people who don't have a particular bias that they're trying to convey. And most people would admit that the distractions of being at home, whether they be the television set or family or pets or the doorbell ringing or all of the things that happen during the day in a home environment, I think there's questions over time whether it really is a more productive environment. I would challenge that assumption and question whether really over time we can all come to the conclusion that it's more productive for us to be working at home than in an office environment. Now, what are the disadvantages of working at home as what I would call an ongoing kind of systemic approach? The first one that I worry about a lot is the onboarding of new employees. I can tell you that every company that I am associated with in various roles that I play, they all have the help wanted sign out. It's interesting. There is a tremendous pent up need to onboard employees. And I think about the employees that have been onboarded over the past many months at these various organizations and what it's like to join an organization via Zoom and not have the ability to really go through some kind of an orientation program, to really understand the culture and how things work at the company, and to develop relationships that are a little bit deeper than you can experience and grow via Zoom. Another thing I believe is a big negative is you lose so much of that sense of teamwork, that ability to come together as a group, either in a planned way or in many cases a spontaneous way, to help one another, to learn from one another, to share with one another. Again, a very difficult thing to do with scheduled appointments via Zoom. Celebrations. One of the things that I just think is so important is to celebrate success. And many of the organizations that I'm affiliated with had very successful years last year. But instead of all coming together, celebrating that success, recognizing the various people and activities that led to that success, those celebrations all went away. And again, everything was very systemically covered via Zoom in very one-way communications, and you lost all the positive energy that came from celebrating success. I already spoke about the social interactions and the fact that it's a definite negative as it relates to having those social relationships and those interactions via the internet. I believe that innovation and creativity is very, very difficult to achieve over the internet. As I think back, whether it be at Domino's or any one of the companies that I'm affiliated with, the ideas that have emanated that have really been transformational in terms of the company and the brand were not a result of some formal scheduled meeting like we tend to manage our time via Zoom. They were a result of people coming together, oftentimes informally in a very unstructured way, and together just creating a great idea. And again, I think that is lost or at least severely impaired in a world where we communicate via Zoom. I think from a leadership perspective, the ability for me to really do a thorough and helpful performance review and development activity with any employee becomes significantly impaired when it's done over the internet, and all I know about you and your performance is what I've seen over the past year via a screen. to develop people, to realize their potential, to understand what their possibilities are in terms of future career steps. I think it's exceedingly difficult to have a kind of a robust program that really gives people a chance to excel, learn, grow, and achieve. Trust. As I mentioned earlier, the whole measurement of whether an organization really has trust, trust at various levels, trust within various areas of the business, whether that exists is instrumental, is as important and as essential as anything I can imagine as it relates to a healthy culture. It's very difficult for me to understand over time how that trust can be built and sustained without that personal connection, that physical connection, that social interaction that I've spoke about. So at the end of the day, I believe that the cons associated with this kind of majority work at home notion can potentially be a culture killer. Companies will actually lose that culture that they've worked so hard to create. If in fact the relationship that I have with you as an employee is pretty much a result of the work assignments you get and the compensation you receive via the internet relationship that we have, I think eventually the culture dissipates and all companies start to look the same. And to my way of thinking, that is a huge, huge negative and a huge threat. The other thing I'd like to talk about as it relates to this is, so many of our organizations and so many of us as leaders are focused on all the important work being done in the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion area. And I think there's a significant issue associated with that as it relates to the office workers versus the folks that I call the marketplace operations workers. If we think back over the past year and a half, and again, many of the organizations that I'm involved in were viewed as essential workers. So these are restaurants that needed to prepare food and deliver it to people, grocery stores, drugstores, delivery services, banks, newspapers and the media, police, firework. I mean, there are so many people, certainly healthcare workers are first and foremost. There are so many people that were out there working on the front lines, doing essential services to keep us all alive and keep us all healthy and keep us all in our fundamental way of life to the degree possible over the last year to year and a half. And while that's all been going on in many organizations, the office workers have been home. And you create a situation where in many instances, the people that are working in those distribution centers, in those retail outlets, in that marketplace operations area, those frontliners in many cases are the most diverse parts of our organizations. And basically we're saying, hey, you got to get up in the morning, you got to put on your uniform and you got to go to work because your job is essential. But in many cases, while we've been saying that to them, our office workers have been home. They've been home taking care of their kids because childcare has been an issue. They've been home because it's more protective of their safety in terms of the pandemic. I get all of that, but it creates a two-tier system that I think from an equity standpoint is something that we should really think about and pay a lot of attention to. I think the burden of dealing with this issue really rests with the company leadership. Leadership in every company have to kind of deal with this issue and decide how are we going to come out of this pandemic and who are we going to be, how are we going to manage this culture, and how are we going to manage this balance between people's desire to continue to work at home an appreciable amount of time versus recreating what we had before. And job number one for these leaders is that in many instances, they need to leave their vacation homes and return to the office themselves. I think in many cases, leaders have enjoyed this opportunity to have a very different lifestyle than the travel and the rigors that were associated with their jobs pre-pandemic. In many cases, they have to lead by example and get back in the office and show that that is the way that we're going to proceed in terms of our work rules. And the last thing that I think is the most important job for every leader is to create a culture and a workplace environment where employees actually want to come to work. To me, it's going to become one of the most interesting tests moving forward. Will the great companies, the companies that are considered the best places to work in America and around the world, will they be the companies that say, you know what, come to work when you want? We're going to turn into a flexible workplace where you kind of come when you're called and come when you're needed, but at the end of the day, you can really decide when you want to come to work. Will those be the great companies, or will the great companies be those places where people actually want to come to the workplace because of the environment, because of the relationship, because of the leadership style, because of the experience that they achieve when they come to work, as opposed to being fundamentally alone at home? There's measures and metrics that all those leaders are going to use, and they're the same ones we always should use. We should be measuring the culture, and we should be paying very close attention in the next few quarters as we kind of find whatever the equilibrium point is in this work at home topic. We should all be thinking about how do we measure whether things are getting better or whether we're losing what we work so hard to gain over time as it relates to our culture. And certainly the Denison Culture Survey, not to provide a commercial here, but that's been a tool that I've used that gives you a great opportunity to really do diagnostics on whether you're getting it right or you're not. Employee turnover is going to be a real important issue here because there is such a demand for workers. We're seeing turnover spikes in virtually every organization I'm affiliated with because there's lots of opportunities out there. There's lots of people being bought away. And the health of your culture is being tested, because if it isn't the kind of culture that is really best in class, you're liable to lose a lot of talent to companies who are willing to buy it away. Employee engagement, the ability to measure employee engagement in all the ways that are out there available to us, is going to be exceedingly important in the next few quarters. And this notion of consistently applied work rules, whether the work rules that are being called upon to be followed by the people in the office and in the headquarters buildings and in the office environment, whether that's consistent with the work rules that are being required of the frontliners and the people that are actually in the marketplace or in the operations area of your company. And at the end of the day, all of this rolls up to the company performance. And how does this impact your costs? How does this impact your revenues? How does this impact your profits? Maybe your stock price, depending the kind of organization you're affiliated with. At the end of the day, over the next few quarters, a lot is going to be learned as it relates to how this whole cultural change gets managed. So that's my thought and my view on this. And Dan, what I'll do at this point is open it up and we can spend whatever remaining time we have chatting about this.
That's great. That's fantastic, Dave. Really appreciate it. And the insight and edge on your comments is really, really terrific. And there are a bunch of good questions here from the participants. Nellie, do you want to start us off by posing a couple of those questions, and I'll try to hold my breath here, bite my tongue for a minute while we get some of the questions from participants on the table.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that I had when you talked about things that we should be looking forward to when we do finally return back or into a hybrid model, what are your recommendations? Do you have any ideas for welcoming people who started during the pandemic into your organization?
Yeah, my approach ties in a little bit with the comments that I made about creating an environment where people want to come to work. I almost think there's a opportunity that's huge for kind of a welcome back. And as opposed to, creating an environment where people are going, oh man, I got to get up and set the alarm and go back to work and get back in the environment. I would be trying to, for the first few weeks, I would be trying very hard to surprise people with some of the most positive energy ideas that I could put a team together and create. What I used to do at companies when I was CEO is I'd take a group of volunteer employees and I called them the Smile Committee. And the Smile Committee had a job that every month they had to come up with some unique way of making every employee smile. And they were given a budget, they were given time to kind of do their work and really create these situations that were completely unique, that people would go home, sit around the supper table with their families and say, you can't believe it, what happened at work today. They brought in ice cream trucks and made us all leave the building and fed us all. Silly, but very important things that say, you know what, it's fun to be here. We're going to surprise you and do things that are fun and unique and interesting and makes you want to come here to be a part of it. I would be working really hard to come up with some of those things to really welcome back people and make them feel like they're home again, as opposed to staying home being the answer.
Dave, do you see organizations that you're associated with essentially taking on kind of onboarding 2.0 practice and process to address that? You know, I should tell everybody here that Nellie Stansberry has been like the key point person in getting us organized to do this great event, and we've never met her. And it's worked great, but that certainly is on my, high on my list here to like meet Nellie and find out what we didn't cover, what we didn't do. But do you see any of the organizations you're involved with explicitly doing kind of onboarding 2.0?
Yes, I think everybody's wrestling with this question as, and three of the companies that I'm on the board of are Michigan-based companies, and Michigan has been in kind of lockdown mode. And again, more of a state mandate. So it really hasn't been, there hasn't been a lot of subjectivity associated with leaders' decisions about how they work. There's been, fundamentally directives coming from government officials as it relates to how they work. And so over the period of time in Michigan, all these companies have hired people. In some instances, I'm on the board and we've onboarded new directors, members of governing body. We've had several board meetings and I've never met them in person. Everything I know about them is a postage stamp size picture on a Zoom call. And I think it's exceedingly important that that leaders think about that and realize there's a whole cohort of people over the last year to year and a half that have joined their organization in one manner or another. And listen, it could be new vendors. It's not just employees,
yes, right.
Other important relationships. How do we go back and amend what we couldn't do before? And that is properly welcome them, onboard them, and make sure they understand what we're all about.
Right. That's great. Nellie, there's a bunch of good questions in the chat, so I'll turn things back to you.
Yeah. I've seen two questions here that sort of discuss a similar topic, which is it possible that there's a generation difference where the younger generation tends to be more used to digital relations and connections, and that they might not be feeling the loss so significantly?
I think that's a very valid point, but I'm not sure the answer is you kind of grew up staring into an iPhone and texting is more comfortable for you than real human interaction. The ultimate answer to that is, well, then let's continue that. I actually think that generation needs to understand more than maybe even those of us who have kind of seen another way. They need to understand the power of positive energy, the power of social interaction, the importance of having friends at work, the importance of understanding more about their coworkers and just what they look like and what they say. I actually think that it's true. There is a generational divide as it relates to the use of technology and the addiction to technology. But I think the great cultures of the future are ones who figure out a way to create a relationship with that generation that's deeper than one that's driven by technology. Again, if you don't, The relationship you have is going to be what work assignments do you give me and what do you pay me? Because if the definition of a culture is what does it feel like to work at that company? If I'm not working at that company and I don't really feel any of that, then it's a pretty, it's a mile wide and an inch deep. And those are the people that are going to skip around from job to job because there's no real emotional connection.
There's also a great question in here about given the labor market, won't the tightness of the labor market, won't the ability to work from home be something that will attract people? And if so, how do you then you really have to wield this culture magnet to draw people that want to come to work. That becomes a competitive issue because it's that versus the convenience.
That's
How
exactly
do you
right.
find?
That's why I made the point. I think the burden on the leaders in companies today is to create an environment where that doesn't become the issue, where basically the way I'm going to bargain for my future talent is to tell them they don't have to come to work.
Right.
I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's the employee that I want, and I'm really sure that's not the relationship I want. So what I want to find is that employee who will give me a chance to demonstrate that the environment that I'm going to provide, and that includes 100 different things. It's probably compensations towards the end of the list. It's what's it like to work there. It's fun. It's energizing. It's opportunistic. It's helping me in my development. It's giving me a new horizon in terms of things I can achieve. It provides me a better way of life than if I was at home alone staring into a computer. That's a burden that I think exists with the leaders of today in attracting the kind of employees that are going to really give their organizations the best chance to succeed in the future.
Big challenge.
Big challenge.
Yeah. Nellie, some other questions that you want to highlight from our participants?
Yeah, this sort of continues what you were just speaking to. Can you see a tendency, or have you seen a tendency in self-organized organizations to involve employees in answering those types of questions? Or, I guess, versus delegating it largely to leadership?
I guess I want to make sure I understand the question. I think for leaders to get in a room and try to think of what's going on in the hearts and minds of their frontline employees and trying to invent whatever the solutions to those things are is the wrong answer. I guess it's one of the reasons why, as I talked about, the culture surveys, the ways to really dig in and find out what is in the hearts and minds, what are the priorities. Because listen, I'm not suggesting that there aren't modifications that can be made in learning from the last year to year and a half. There may be organizations that say, you know what, we're going to turn into a 4-day office work week, and that 5th day, that Friday or that Monday or however they decide to organize it, maybe it's a Wednesday, we're going to give people the optionality to work at home. There's going to be hybrid models that can work very well for organizations that are a result of what we learned, and maybe we can be more efficient, maybe we can satisfy employees' needs. There are opportunities to look at that. But I believe it has to be structured. It can't be, we're never going to have the whole team together at one time because they're all going to be making their own choices as to when they come to work and when they don't. I think it has to be structured, and it has to be bought into by the frontliners. It's got to emanate from them in terms of what works for us, what feels right for us, what makes sense to us, and what satisfies us. Or you're not going to be able to keep the talent that you want to keep. So I think that level of engagement and understanding is super important.
It's really, really great that you highlight the equity issue too. Domino's, for those who don't, know or haven't thought about it much, has about 1,500 people in headquarters, and 15 or 20 of whom are there on any given day. and they're still operating and it's still been very successful. But then the vast number of your people are in stores, distribution centers, delivering pizzas, and the call for equity here, especially in a retail structure industry, is really pretty profound. I mean, I think you could also argue that this is going to shake out a lot by industry. I mean, if you're a software developer that talks on a Zoom call with the person down the hall when they're in the office, maybe the gains are less than where there are people that really have to work on the front line, suited up. Healthcare. Can the researchers stay? The researchers can't even stay home. They got to go into the lab. But that equity issue and how companies are responding to that, I think that everybody's been so busy trying to survive and thrive that we're just starting to see creative solutions to doing that. I think it's just getting started. What's your perspective on that, Dave?
Yeah, listen, I think there's a reason why a lot of elected government officials don't run companies. I just don't get it, and I'm a little bit offended by it. And I'll use Domino's as an example. The reality is, you're right, man. We have 1,500 or so people working in our what we call World Resource Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and by government mandate, they're not allowed to come to work.
Right.
Yet the government says we want to eat pizza. We want all those stores to be open. We want all the delivery people to deliver, which means our supply chain has to be intact, which means our commissaries have to be working to make dough and create all the ingredients and provide all the supplies we need to operate those stores. So there's tens of thousands of people out there working every day. And fundamentally, what the government's saying is, we know they've got childcare issues, but that's okay. They're necessary. We know they're taking health risks by being out there working, but that's okay. We're going to try to provide them all the protection and all the standards that are required. But those of you working in the office, we're more concerned about your childcare issues. We're more concerned about your health and safety. And as a result, we're going to put a different standard of conduct or work rules on you. It's not right. In my opinion, it's just not right. And it creates an inequity that's inappropriate. And in many cases, as I indicated earlier, the people that are out there on the front lines doing those jobs are a way more diverse community than you're typically going to find in those office buildings. And if we're really going to preach the issue of equity, then let's be consistent.
And what are some of the innovations that that Domino's has, or other companies that you're connected with, have pursued to try to manage that, to try to compensate, to try to integrate?
Yeah, I think whether it's PetSmart or Domino's or any one of the companies, Herman Miller, any of the companies I'm affiliated with, I think they've all done their very, very best to try to create as many contact and touch points with the frontliners as possible. These huge town hall Zoom meetings with thousands of people tuned in, where leaders are trying to stay connected. They're trying to communicate. They're trying to be transparent. They're trying to be encouraging and motivating to the degree possible, again, in this kind of one-way communication device that we've all become somewhat addicted to. But I would suggest that, everybody's done the best they could during this period of time, but we're rapidly approaching the point, God willing, where we can shift back into something that's way more closer to normal. And in my opinion, the first thing we need to do is leaders need to get back to work. They need to lead by example. They need to bring people in. They need to put their arms around them, welcome them back, and get back to something that was closer to what we once had, as opposed to something that we've kind of put together by necessity over the recent past.
That's great. Thank you. Nellie, another question from the participants?
Yeah. You talked early on quite a bit about the importance of building trust. And in your experience, what are some useful tools for measuring that within your organization?
Well, again, it sounds like a commercial, but I have always leaned really heavily on the culture survey as a way to really get unfiltered uh, views from team members as it relates to what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong, and the ability to look at that not only as an entire organization, but to look at it by division, by department, by subsidiary, even all the way down to the leadership level, has been incredibly important. And I've used it. I've used it as a development tool for my leaders. It becomes one of the criteria on which they're measured in terms of their leadership performance. I've used it as it relates to how we construct our plans and programs in terms of support and training and development of our employees. That feedback mechanism is exceedingly important. And if you feel that trust slipping away, if it's more of a local problem in a particular division or department, it's pretty easy to go in and figure out what's the problem and take whatever steps are necessary to fix it. If you start to see that as a more systemic thing across the organization, then you better get your leadership team together and well, first of all, you need to make sure you got the right leadership team, and then you got to bring them together and you got to address that situation. Because if you don't have trust, then at the end of the day, anything else you do is going to come across as phony, and it isn't going to work.
So the first priority, if we're all trying to script our action plans for, back to the future, um, the what are the priorities? And you've outlined one really clear. You need to get your leadership team together live and in person, and not have it be kind of a proxy for a Zoom call for an hour. But you need to spend the time to think through what's happened and what we're going to do next. Are there other priorities in terms of the types of functions, the types of roles that you think are benefit most by direct personal contact?
Well, I think what's essential right now is, Dan, to your point, bring your leadership team together and get everybody back connected. And then my edict to them would be, I don't want to see any of you sitting in your office for the next 3 months. I want you to get on the road and get out there and shake hands and pat on the back and thank all of these essential workers who have been out there fighting the fight while we've been fundamentally quarantined. We got to get out there. We got to get visible. We got to connect. We got to reconnect. In some cases, we have to introduce ourselves to people who have never met us.
That's right.
And we need to put a face and a personality and a voice above and beyond what people have heard over Zoom, to redevelop the relationship and the trust that we want to have with our employees. And you can't do that by saying, okay, I'm back in the office. That's great. But being back in the office isn't enough.
Right.
Walk around management is going to be more important than it's ever been within the office environment. And in many instances, at least in the business models that I'm affiliated with, our leaders have got to get on the road again and get up close and personal with the people out there who have really done heroic work over the past year to 18 months.
Wow. That's terrific, because you make me think that you can definitely, feel like you, in some jobs where you have to go to the office so that you can disconnect there. And it's about connection. I think one of the things that you saw in the early phases of the pandemic was people that used it to reach out and connect, actually develop pretty innovative ways of connecting with people, even though it was virtually. A friend of mine said, well, don't forget that along with social distancing comes distant socializing. So it's actually much easier and to connect with somebody that's halfway around the world, and there's fewer barriers to doing that. But using the face-to-face work time to review our spreadsheets, well, at least if we review them together. But the message to connect and using that time to make a human connection that's going to build a bond, that's really important.
Yeah, I think you mix the old with the new. Like one of the things that I always did, and I just thought it was cool, maybe it was more selfish for me, but the HR department at the beginning of every month would give me a spreadsheet and it would tell me every employee that was celebrating their 5th, 10th, 15th, 20th, 25th, 30th anniversary with the company during that month. And I keep that spreadsheet on my desk, and every day I'd look at it, and there might be 4 people today that are celebrating what I called milestone anniversaries. And I would call them and just thank them, congratulate them, thank them for their years of service, and tell them how much they're appreciated. It was a way for me to connect with people that typically I wouldn't be connecting with. Now I think about that, and I if I were running a company today, I'd be doing it still, but instead I'd be FaceTime or I'd be Zooming, because it would give me a chance to even make that experience and that
Much broader,
stronger or better. So, it's how do you leverage what we can do today that we couldn't do back when I was running companies? How do we use it to make it even better? It's not, boy, now that we're Zooming, I don't have to do that anymore. At least in my opinion, I think those things still work.
That's great. Nellie, any other questions in the chat or Q&A that you want to pose for Dave?
Yeah, I have one last question that I think would be super interesting, and you've already sort of touched on this. And I'll say on the onset of the question that you've sort of talked about the importance of organizations and leaders in incentivizing and encouraging their workforce to come back and building out reasons why they should be excited to come back. So this might just be a continuation of that. But the question is, do you think that for people working from home, which organization they are working for will or has in the past year mattered less?
The fact that they've worked at home, does it mean that they've mattered less to the organization? Is that the question?
Or that it's like your comment that it's gotten kind of generic, that, there's not so much of a connection.
See, I think over the past year to year and a half, if you've been with an organization for a long period of time or a substantial period of time, you understand the culture, you had good relationships with your coworkers, with your leaders, you were pretty much comfortable going into this pandemic. I think for a period of a few quarters, which is kind of what we've been suffering through, there's enough of an understanding and clarity and enough relationships there that getting through this period of time has probably not been all that harmful or damaging. And in fact, it's probably in many cases felt okay. This is the work. Now, if you're a new person that's come in during this period of time, forget it. You can't feel as connected as you would. You haven't gone through new team member orientation. You haven't even experienced the workplace. So how can you even comment on what the workplace is like? And I would suggest that if somebody was relatively new and still trying to figure it out going into this, this has been a real setback. And so I think it takes on a variety of flavors. I think over time, the connection is going to get more diluted for those companies who have said, you know what, go live where you want to live and just work from home. And, we're going to cut our office space in half and save all those dollars. And our relationship from this point forward will be via the internet. I think those companies are going to wake up one day and regret it, because over time, they're going to lose what they once had. And they're going to find out how that manifests itself in lost productivity, in lost trust. They're going to see it show up in their turnover figures. And at some point in time, they're going to be asking for more office space and try to get people to come back to work. That's my personal view.
And you can really see clearly in Dave's comments and style, this is someone who's held up well during the pandemic, and is good on Zoom, good on video, no problem. But as well as being a really well-informed kind of competitive policy strategy approach for, running and advising major corporations, there's also a level of authenticity that, hey, I miss this connection thing. And so let's not forget what we had, and let's get together and figure out how to get as much of it back as we can and how to build that out for the future.
Amen.
Yeah. And we thank you so much, David, for a great job and for joining us and for all that you've done for us and for the companies that you're affiliated with. It's a real pleasure. And we thank you.
I've enjoyed it, Dan. Thank you. And good wishes to everybody.